To Zanarkand, a Final Fantasy X fan-made audiobook project. Chapter 2, Out of the Frying Pan. The first sensation was cold, a biting, stinging cold that dragged Tidus out of the black void of unconsciousness. His face was wet and freezing water was lapping against his cheek and into his ear, jolting him awake. He blinked a few times, his eyes stinging from the salt, and groaned as his senses returned slowly. The air was heavy, the smell of the ocean filling his nose, and every inch of his body ached as though he'd been battered by a tidal wave. He probably had been, he thought. Slowly he pushed himself up, his hands slipping against the rough surface beneath him. The sharp texture bit into his palms, gritty, wet and uneven, and he realized he was draped over a hunk of stone. As his vision cleared, he took in his surroundings. Above him, the sky churned with dark, swirling clouds. A storm was either coming or it had just been. The light was dim, grey and muted, casting the world around him in sombre tones. And there was water. Endless water, stretching out in every direction, an infinite expanse of cold, dark ocean. The waves rippled gently, the calm surface betraying the chaos that had brought him here. Tidus's breath caught as he turned his head, trying to find some sense of orientation, but there was nothing. No sign of the stadium, no Zanarkand, no Orin. He was alone in the middle of the ocean on a random platform of stone. Just water, mist, and sky. No, not just water. Something was in front of him. Tidus squinted through the mist, his heart skipping a beat as he realized it was a structure, a building half submerged in the sea. It loomed over the gently lapping waves, its dark, moss-covered stone glistening from the spray. The architecture was unfamiliar, nothing like the sleek metallic spires of Zanarkand. This was old, ancient even. The stone was weathered and cracked, patches of green moss creeping over its surface like veins. Spires jutted upward at odd angles, giving the building the appearance of a temple almost, though its purpose was lost to time. It looked like it didn't belong here, like it had been plucked from some forgotten age and dropped unceremoniously into the middle of the ocean. Tidus shivered, the chill of the water seeping into his bones as he took a shaky breath. He looked down at the stone he was laying on, a chunk of the same ancient material, its edges jagged and broken, as though it had been torn from the larger structure. It probably had been, he thought to himself. Pushing himself to his knees, he tried to get his bearings, but his limbs felt heavy and sluggish, his body weighed down by exhaustion and the lingering cold. What is this place? He muttered, his voice hoarse and barely audible over the gentle sound of the waves. He had never bothered to learn of the world outside of Zanarkand, and so had no idea what this place could even be. He was, instead, always so focused on Blitzball, and, if he was being honest with himself, getting out from under his father's shadow. He shook his head, trying to dispel the disorientation as his fingers curled against the rough surface of the stone. He needed to move, staying here wasn't an option. He slid off the jagged stone into the water with a splash, the freezing ocean shocking him awake in the way nothing else could. The chill bit through his skin like needles, and for a moment he kicked instinctively to stay afloat, his breath sharp and uneven. But as his body adjusted, he looked down into the depths, expecting only the endless, black void of open ocean. Instead he froze, his eyes wide, taking in the impossible sight beneath him. The water wasn't opaque or empty. The dim light filtering through the clouds above gave him just enough visibility to see something. Structures, shapes, lines that didn't belong in the natural seafloor. Tidus blinked, almost questioning his own eyes, but as he adjusted to the clarity of the water, the truth emerged. It wasn't just a temple. What he thought was a lone, lopsided structure was only the tip of something much larger. Below the surface, an entire town stretched out across the relatively shallow ocean floor. Was it really the ocean floor, he thought to himself? like a forgotten ruin swallowed by the sea. Stone buildings sprawled outward into the abyss, their forms weathered and broken, but still unmistakable. Homes, pillars, courtyards, all long claimed by the sea. Some were crooked, leaning where the earth had given way beneath them. Others were cracked down the middle, as though something massive had slammed into them. Titus could see the evidence of collapse everywhere. Chunks of walls scattered like rubble, roofs caved in, doorways leading to nothing but darkness. Even the hunk of stone he had been on was seemingly the roof of a tall building on a hill, as he could see the slope of the seabed descend into the rest of the scattered buildings. There even appeared to be a few more nearby, just barely making contact with the surface. He missed them from above, but below they were just about visible in the murky greenish haze. The sheer scale of it left him breathless. He floated in the water, staring down into the depths, his mind struggling to process the magnitude. What happened here? The silence of the underwater world made the town seem even more tragic, as if it had fallen victim to some ancient catastrophe, an earthquake, maybe, that had pulled the entire place into the depths. It was too large to have been anything other than a city, perhaps even an island metropolis like Zanarkand, though maybe a little more low-tech judging by the buildings. His gut twisted. Did that monster, Sin, do this? Is this what's happening to Zanarkand right now? The mystery gnawed at him, and he desperately wanted to get back to Zanarkand, but the cold was a sharper reminder of his reality. His blitzball uniform, designed for speed and flexibility in water, did little to ward off the bone-deep chill of the open sea. He felt his muscles stiffening, the cold seeping deep into his core, and his teeth chattered despite his best efforts to suppress it. Keep moving, or you'll freeze here, he thought to himself. He pushed himself forward, swimming along the surface toward the temple, the only building that broke through the waves. Its spires loomed overhead, the stones slick with moss and algae. He stayed near the surface, his gaze flicking down occasionally, unable to stop himself from glancing at the expansive ruins below. Knowing how much there was beneath him freaked him out a little bit. They stretched beyond sight, disappearing into the deeper, darker parts of the ocean where light couldn't reach. He wondered, just for a moment, how far down it all went. How much more of the city remained buried in the deep, hidden away like a forgotten memory. Reaching the temple's base, Titus spotted a narrow opening, an old window, jagged at its edges, but just wide enough for him to squeeze through. With some effort, he pulled himself up, his wet hands slipping on the moss-covered frame. He finally managed to haul himself into the building, collapsing onto the floor inside with a grunt. The surface was as cold and wet as the outside stone, and the air within felt heavy and damp and strangely still, as though it had been holding its breath for centuries. The room was small, its door blocked entirely by a mound of rubble, but there was a large hole in the floor that led somewhere into darkness below. Titus peered through it cautiously, the faint glow of water reflecting off the edges of the stone. There wasn't another way forward. Grimacing, he lowered himself through the hole, his feet searching for purchase as he slipped into the lower level. The descent into the temple was treacherous, what with every surface slick with wet moss that clung stubbornly to the walls and floors, as well as the entire building itself being on a tilt as the ocean slowly claimed it over time. Water dripped steadily from the cracked ceiling, the sound echoing unnervingly in the vast emptiness, amplifying the silence that lingered. Titus moved with cautious precision, his steps deliberate as he navigated the labyrinthine interior. There did come a point where he realized he must have been well below the level of the ocean, and that the temple's interior was one big air pocket. The thought of the open ocean being just beyond the stone walls was slightly unnerving. He kept imagining how much pressure the walls must be under, but he couldn't think of that now. The architecture of the building was completely foreign to him too. Great stone corridors adorned with intricate weathered symbols, carved deep into the walls, spiraling and intersecting like some forgotten language. Here and there, fragments of stained glass still clung to rusted iron frames, broken edges catching faint light and scattering fractured pools of colour across the wet stone. Some passages were impassable, choked with debris and massive chunks of collapsed stone, while others gave way to gaping holes that plunged into shadowy pools of dark water below. The broken remains of staircases spiraled downwards, their surfaces uneven and cracked, forcing Titus to move where he could, along moss-slicked corridors, over collapsed walls, and through narrow openings half swallowed by rubble, each path dragging him deeper into the ancient, haunted heart of the temple. The air was colder down here. He could feel it seeping into his bones. The moisture hung thick in the space, and every breath felt heavy, tinged with the faint scent of salt and decay. Despite its narrow paths and precarious ledges, the building seemed alive, almost, as though it had been waiting for someone to wander its halls. Either that, or maybe the loneliness was starting to seep in, Titus thought. Eventually, he emerged into a much larger space, and the sight made him pause. The chamber was massive, a vast circular room that stretched upward far beyond what he'd seen so far. Balconies ringed the chamber at various levels, some half-collapsed, others intact, like ribs surrounding a great hollow chest. A large hole in the ceiling high above allowed a weak sliver of light to spill down, illuminating the gloom in fractured patches. The floor of the chamber below him was surrounded by elevated stone seats, as well as large statues around a central floor space. Most of the statues were crumbled, except for one of what appeared to be an armoured woman with a raised sword in hand. The floor was strewn with rubble and broken stone. Puddles reflected the grey light, and water streamed down in thin rivulets from the cracks above, forming wet trails across the walls. Titus found himself standing on the second floor, one of the many balconies that lined the chamber. He stepped forward, his footsteps echoing faintly, and leaned over the railing to take in the scale of the place. A faint wind stirred, though he couldn't tell where it came from. He turned his head and spotted a gap in the railing where part of it had crumbled away. Vines hung down over the edge, damp and glistening, leading to the floor far below. Titus frowned, eyeing the vines warily. It wasn't the smartest idea, but he could see no other way down. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Just don't look down." Gripping the vines tightly, Titus swung his legs over the edge and began to climb down. His hands slid slightly on the wet surface, but he tightened his grip, his arms straining to support his weight. The cold definitely made it harder to hold on, his fingers stiff and trembling, but he was determined. He glanced down only once, regretting it instantly. The floor seemed impossibly far, and the rubble below looked far less forgiving than the moss-covered walls. He swallowed hard and maintained his descent, until his foot slipped. The vine jerked in his grasp as his body twisted, the slick surface betraying him. For a split second, he hung suspended in the air, his hands straining desperately to hold on, but the wet vine slipped free of his grasp. "Damn it!" Titus shouted as he fell. The world tilted, his vision blurring as he plummeted toward the floor below. He hit the ground hard, his body slamming into the cold wet stone. Pain shot through his shoulder and back, knocking the air from his lungs. He gasped, curling onto his side, every nerve in his body screaming in protest. For a moment he lay there, stunned, the sound of the water dripping filling the space around him. The stone was cold against his cheek, seeping through his soaked clothes as he groaned softly. That was real stupid, he muttered weakly, wincing as he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. His muscles protested every movement, but he managed to sit up, leaning heavily against a chunk of rubble as he caught his breath. The chamber loomed around him, vast and empty, its silence almost mocking. Water dripped steadily, echoing faintly in the gloom, and the sliver of light from above illuminated the dust swirling in the damp air. Titus let his head fall back, staring up at the vine he'd fallen from, his chest heaving. Great. Just great. He groaned as he staggered fully upright, the bruises from his fall already beginning to throb. The floor beneath him felt colder than ice, and he shivered as he rubbed his arms briskly and scanned the massive chamber around him. His eyes landed on two doors. The first was a massive set of stone double doors directly across the chamber, carved with strange patterns that twisted and curved like the waves of the ocean. Opposite them, on the far wall, a narrow set of stone steps climbed upward, leading to an ornate, smaller stone door. Titus sighed and headed for the large doors first, his boots splashing faintly in the shallow puddles strewn across the floor. They were enormous, easily 3 times his height, with weathered edges and carvings that looked older than anything he'd seen yet. Planting his hands against the cold surface, he pushed. Nothing. He dug his feet into the stone, straining harder, his muscles screaming in protest. The doors didn't budge so much as an inch, as though the stone had fused over time into one immovable slab. Titus scowled, panting and wiping the sweat from his brow. Figures, he muttered. No way out that easy. He turned and made his way toward the stone staircase. His boots slipped on the wet steps more than once, forcing him to catch himself against the walls as he climbed. The ornate door at the top stood in stark contrast to the others he'd seen. It was beautiful, strangely untouched by time, its surface smooth except for a series of intricate symbols running in concentric patterns around its edges. The shapes reminded Titus of waves again, spirals curving inward toward the centre, where a circular mark was etched faintly into the stone. Titus reached out and pushed, expecting it to resist. And it did. Not even a shiver. "Come on!" he shouted, slamming his fist against the door. His voice echoed through the chamber, mocking him. He shoved harder, rattling the cold surface with his shoulder. Still nothing. Defeated, he exhaled and turned to head back down the steps. But then he stopped. His ears caught something faint, something soft. He turned back slowly, leaning closer to the door, listening hard. The sound was just beyond hearing, a fragile thread of noise that seemed to ride the air itself. He pressed his ear against the door, the cold stone biting against his skin, but the sound was clearer now, faint, quiet, and impossibly distant. A voice, singing. Titus's brow furrowed, his heart pounding faster as he strained to hear. The voice was high and light, a melody that drifted like mist on the wind. He couldn't make out any words, but it sent chills down his spine all the same. Or was it the wind? He wondered. But no, there was something deliberate about the sound, something haunting and somewhat sad, a song that didn't belong to the dead air of this place. "Hey!" Titus shouted suddenly, banging his fist against the door. "Anyone there? Can you hear me?" His voice echoed, bouncing off the walls of the great chamber around him. He pounded on the door again, harder this time, his fists stinging from the impact. "Hey, I'm stuck in here! Help!" The singing didn't stop. It didn't change. It was as if whoever was singing couldn't hear him at all. Titus slowly dropped his hands, his heart sinking into his stomach. He took a step back from the door, staring at it as the sound faded from hearing. He couldn't even hear it now, 3 feet from the door. Had it ever been there in the first place? "Yes, I'm hearing things now," he mumbled, shivering harder as the cold began to gnaw at him. He rubbed his arms briskly, the moisture in the air and his soaked clothing biting through his skin. The reality of his situation crept in all at once. He was trapped. The vine he'd climbed down from the second floor hung far out of reach. Neither door would move. There was no deeper hole to climb into. He felt the chill settle deeper, as if the stone itself were trying to swallow him. It really was stupid to come down here, he muttered bitterly, shaking his head. He trudged back down the stairs, his shoes skidding on the slick stone, and stopped at the edge of the rubble. The stone was piled high, a mess of collapsed ceiling or wall that looked like it had been shoved deliberately into place. Wedged within the debris were splintered pieces of furniture, a wooden chair, broken shelves, shattered beams. Titus's brow furrowed as he took it all in. "What happened here?" he murmured, crouching closer. It wasn't just rubble. This looked deliberate. Whoever had been here before him had stacked anything they could find to block the door, like they'd been trying to keep something out. The thought made his skin crawl, but he pushed it aside as he spotted something half buried in the debris. It looked like a writing desk. Titus stepped closer, brushing aside broken wood and bits of stone to get a better look. The desk was damaged, its edges cracked, but it was intact enough to be opened. He crouched and tugged on one of the drawers. It creaked stubbornly before giving way, revealing a surprising find. A letter. The parchment was fragile, its edges frayed and yellowed with age, yet somehow spared from the damp that permeated everything else. The ink had faded in places, sure, leaving most of the text smudged and illegible. But Titus tilted it toward the faint light, his eyes narrowing, and he tried to make out what he could. Words began to make sense among the faded scrawls, bits of sentences here and there. "My son," or "Hope you will one day forgive." He also saw, "People will look to you and think," along with, "Do what I could not." The signature at the bottom was blurred, the strokes running together in an unreadable smear. Only the first letter remained intact, a bold and unmistakable J. Titus's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the letter for a long time, his mind whirling. He read the words, "My son," again and again. His throat felt dry, the words echoing in his head. He couldn't stop himself from thinking it, from connecting the pieces, even though he didn't want to. Ject. "No," Titus muttered, shaking his head. "No way. Impossible. It's just a coincidence. It has to be." But his hands were trembling. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his pocket as though afraid to damage it further. He didn't know why he was keeping it, maybe as proof, maybe because something in him didn't want to leave it behind. Rattled, Titus stood up and glanced around. The cold truly was relentless now, the damp air clinging to his skin like frost. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering violently as his breaths came out in foggy clouds. He moved back to the writing desk, shivering as he crouched down. His hands trembled as he gripped one of its legs, wrenching at the aged wood in an attempt to break it loose. It gave a groan of protest, but the moisture had seeped so deeply into the material that instead of snapping cleanly, it splintered in his hands, sharp and wet to the touch. He hissed under his breath, tossing the piece aside and trying again with another part of the desk. The results were no better. Everything in the rubble was damp, rotten, and soaked through by years of neglect, utterly useless as firewood. He turned his attention to the pile of debris blocking the mysterious door. Maybe he could pull some of it down and clear a path. He stood, planting his feet and grabbing at the nearest piece of rubble, a jagged chunk of stone. His muscles strained as he tried to lift it, but it didn't budge. He shifted to a smaller piece, digging his fingers into cracks for leverage, but his strength was failing. He was simply too cold, too weak, and the wet stone slipped from his grasp. He slumped against the pile, his breath fogging in the frigid air, and pressed his forehead against the damp rock. "Come on," he muttered, but even he didn't believe his own plea. Shivering violently, he looked around the chamber for anything else. His eyes landed on a small alcove beneath the remnants of a first-floor balcony. It was mostly blocked off by fallen beams and chunks of stone, but it seemed sheltered at the very least. The ground beneath it seemed drier than the rest of the chamber. It really wasn't much, but it was better than staying out in the open. Titus staggered over, crouching low to fit through the gap in the debris, and curled up under the overhang. Leaning his back against the cold wall, he wrapped his arms tightly around his knees and tried to focus on the smallest semblance of warmth in his body. The stone beneath him was still hard and freezing, but at least it wasn't completely drenched. For a moment, he let his head rest against the wall and closed his eyes, blocking out the oppressive vastness of the chamber. Thoughts of Zanarkand rose in his mind. He pictured the bright lights of the city, the hum of life that never stopped, and the way the skyline glittered under the stars. It felt so far away now, like a dream slipping through his fingers. His mind jumped to the chaos of the stadium, the roar of the crowd, the adrenaline of the game, and then to the horrifying events that had followed. The creature Oren had called Sin, tearing through his city, a force of nature, unstoppable and merciless. Was Zanarkand even still standing? He felt a ringing in his ears at the thought, but he forced himself to shove it aside. Oren. That man was another puzzle. His sudden appearance, his calm amidst the destruction. Titus had questions that only multiplied the longer he thought about it. Then again, Oren had always been a mystery. Titus couldn't pinpoint exactly when he'd first met him, 9, maybe 10 years ago. It had been months after Jecht disappeared, when Oren had showed up at his home and introduced himself to Titus's mother as a friend of Jecht's. His mom hadn't believed it for a second. She'd taken one look at the large flask Oren carried on his belt and decided he was just one of Jecht's drinking buddies he owed money to. And maybe she wasn't entirely wrong, because Oren never denied it. But over the years, he kept showing up. He would visit Zanarkand from time to time, and every visit felt deliberate. He always seemed to be checking in on Titus, asking about his life, his games, his training. It didn't make sense to Titus at first. Oren wasn't exactly the kind of guy you could imagine caring about anyone's day-to-day life. He certainly wasn't a talker, didn't share much about himself, and yet he had a way of showing up just when Titus needed someone. His mom had hated it. She always muttered under her breath when Oren came around, but Titus had grown used to it. He had taken to muttering about a lot of people after Jecht disappeared. Titus figured Oren really was a friend of Jecht's, and maybe just felt responsible for keeping an eye on Jecht's family, even after his mom died a year after Jecht's disappearance. He had been a constant, in his own strange way. And now Oren had dragged him into whatever this was. Titus groaned and buried his face in his arms. The memories of Oren and Jecht only made the present feel more isolating. The cold was truly unbearable now. It chewed at him relentlessly, seeping into his very core. He stared at the faint beams of light filtering through the hole high above, watching as the light grew dimmer and dimmer. Night must be falling. Titus knew he should move. He should get up and try to warm himself somehow. Jumping jacks, running in place, something. But his body simply wasn't cooperating. His limbs felt heavy, his head even heavier, and every shiver drained more of his strength. "Come on," he whispered hoarsely. "Move." But he didn't. He couldn't. The wet, the cold, the exhaustion, it was all simply too much. He hugged his knees tighter, pressing his forehead against them as the ache in his muscles gave way to a dull numbness. His breaths came slower, his shivers less frequent, and an unnatural heaviness began to settle over him. A dark thought whispered in the back of his mind, a cruel and insistent voice he couldn't ignore any longer. "You're not getting out of here." Titus clenched his teeth, trying to push the thought away, but it burrowed deeper, wrapping itself around his resolve like a vice. He imagined himself trapped in this temple, his body frozen and lifeless, left to be swallowed by the dark waters below. He didn't even know where he was, what this place is, or anything. He wanted to scream, to fight against the hopelessness creeping in, but all he could do was sit there, clutching himself tighter as the exhaustion finally overtook him. His eyelids grew heavier, his mind drifting further and further from the freezing chamber. The ache in his body faded into a distant hum, and he slumped against the wall, his breaths shallow now. He drifted between consciousness and the void, the darkness pressing on him as the cold seeped into his bones. The dripping of water resonated through the half-flooded temple, a rhythmic punctuation to his otherwise featureless dream. The sound grew louder, more distinct, almost melodic, as if the droplets formed a strange, incomprehensible language amongst themselves. Wait! His eyes snapped open. The world was still, just the sound of water dripping from the cracks in the stone above him into the shallow pools that dotted the chamber floor. His breath came in uneven gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained his ears, searching for something, anything beyond the dripping. And then he heard what he thought he had heard the first time. Voices. Faint at first, muffled by distance and the thick stone walls, but they were there, real and human. His pulse quickened, the desperate energy surging through his exhausted limbs. He pushed himself upright, his body trembling from the effort. His clothes clung to his skin, still damp and freezing, but the discomfort barely registered. He was no longer alone. He stumbled forward, his legs unsteady beneath him. The voices were coming from beyond the pile of rubble, blocking the large doorway at the far side of the chamber. Looking at them again, the broken slabs truly were massive, some as large as he was, forming an impassable barrier between him and whoever was on the other side. It was only now Tidus noticed that it actually looked like the wall itself had collapsed inwards. He took a deep breath, his throat dry and raw, then shouted, "Hey! Help! I'm in here!" His voice cracked, barely more than a hoarse rasp. He swallowed hard and tried again, louder this time. "Help! Someone! I'm trapped!" The voices on the other side faltered. A moment of silence, then an excited clamour. More voices now, getting closer, overlapping, hurried, speaking in a language he didn't understand. They were talking to each other, their words urgent, almost frantic. Tidus pressed himself against the rubble, straining to hear. They were close. He could hear them shifting debris, moving stones. They had heard him. Relief flooded his chest, hot and overwhelming. He was going to get out of here. He was really going to be saved. Whoever was on the other side, they were all shouting now, repeating something, the same phrase over and over again. He frowned, trying to make sense of it. It almost sounded like they were saying, "Cat, pig?" Well, that couldn't be right. What kind of language was that? "I don't understand. Can you hear me? I need help." The voices didn't change. The same phrase repeated again and again, louder now, more forceful. Tidus's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. They were almost shouting now, the intensity building with each repetition. The stones shifted as they worked, but there was something frantic in their movements, like they were racing against something. Then, amidst the clamour, a single voice cut through the noise, high-pitched, young, a girl's, clear as day. "Get back!" Tidus didn't think. He reacted, realizing in an instant what was happening and feeling stupid for not realizing sooner. He turned and ran, instinct screaming at him to move. His feet splashed through the shallow water as he dove behind a pillar thick with ivy and moss, pressing himself against the damp stone. A heartbeat later, the world erupted. A deafening explosion shattered the air, shaking the very foundation of the temple. The force of it sent a wave of heat and dust rushing through the chamber, knocking Tidus onto his side. Chunks of debris rained down, splashing into the water, clattering against the stone. The roar of destruction echoed off the walls, reverberating through his skull. For a moment, everything was chaos. Dust filled the air, thick and choking, turning the chamber into a hazy blur of shadows and flickering light. Tidus coughed, his lungs burning as he struggled to suck in clean air. His ears rang, a high-pitched whine blotting out all other sound. Slowly, he pushed himself upright, blinking through the haze. The doorway, the rubble, it was gone. Simply gone. Blown apart, reduced to scattered chunks of stone and rock. A gaping hole remained where the obstruction had been, dust swirling in the air like smoke. 5 figures stepped through the dissipating haze, their silhouettes cutting sharply against the dim light filtering from above. As the dust settled, Titus got his first clear look at them, and immediately knew they were not from Zanarkand. 4 men and 1 woman. The men carried weapons, sleek metallic firearms that looked more worn and rusted than anything he'd seen on the city guard's high-tech arsenal. Their clothing was strange, foreign. No 2 of them dressed exactly the same, dressed in bright colours with straps, masks, pouches, goggles, metal plates. Metal, in fact, glinted at their belts and shoulders, intricate patterns etched into the weapons as well. Their boots were sturdy, well-worn and caked in grime. One wore a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, another had a visor covering his eyes, while the tallest had a crude tattoo running down the side of his jaw. Titus couldn't tell if they were dressed for rain, sun, or snow, hiking or diving or even combat. Their dress was just so unusual and erratic. Then there was the woman. She stood apart from them, her stance relaxed, one hip cocked to the side. Unlike the others, she wasn't clad in armour or tactical gear, but instead wore something that immediately struck Titus as familiar, a streamlined swimsuit, similar to the kind blitzball players wore. It clung to her slender frame, dark blue and black with subtle patterns running along the fabric. Besides the swimsuit, she wore only a single armoured sleeve covering her right arm up to the shoulder. Straps of various pouches and small devices hung at her hips, giving her an air of readiness, despite the otherwise minimal clothing. She had a mess of blonde hair protruding from the back of the face mask she had on. Come to think of it, Titus noticed he couldn't see any of their faces properly. They were all wearing either masks or goggles or scarves of some kind. He barely had time to process any of this before one of the men barked something in a language he didn't recognize. Rao! Frana Yaniwi! The second man, slightly shorter with a grizzled jaw and a gun resting against his shoulder, pointed toward Titus and sneered. Raku Jandrana! The others immediately tensed, and before Titus could react, one of them lunged forward, seizing a fistful of his damp, spiky blonde hair and yanking his head back. Pain flared through his scalp as he let out an instinctive shout. Hey, let me go! He struggled, but the grip was ironclad. Panic started to well up in his chest, and it took everything in him not to lose it right there and then. The first man stepped closer, studying him with a suspicious glare. Friedek Drek? His voice was hard, demanding. The second man spat onto the wet stone and tightened his grip on the gun. I fiend! Eresi tekicha! The third, the one with the visor, took a step forward, his fingers twitching near the grip of his weapon. Whack! Edeku! The fourth, the tattooed one, barely shifted, his stance neutral but alert. Fagemed! Titus had no idea what they were saying, but the tension in the air made one thing clear. They were not happy to see him. Then, suddenly, the woman stepped forward and smacked the visor-wearing man over the head. The slap wasn't hard, more an exaggerated correction than an attack, but it caught the man off guard enough that he stumbled slightly. Tut pa kebibet, rija wi ajan ka I veyet erisa tikecha? Her voice was sharp, commanding, but carried an unmistakable air of irritation. Titus may not have been able to see her face, but judging by her voice and build, he got the feeling she was young, possibly even younger than him. Hey, what's going on? I didn't do anything. Who are you guys? His voice cracked slightly from the cold and exhaustion, but his frustration burned through. He was still being held by his hair, squirming against the iron grip. He could smell the sweat off of his captor. The woman exhaled through her nose and shot him a glance. and Titus could see her eyes through the visor of her mask. Calculating, but not entirely hostile. She turned on her heel and walked back towards the shattered entrance with a swagger to her walk, calling out over her shoulder, "Ralusak Federic!" Without hesitation, the 4 men followed her lead. Titus felt his hair released, only for the cold, unyielding barrel of a gun to press into his back. A sharp jab forced him forward, his muscles stiff from the cold and his mind racing with a million questions.